Okay, we are live on YouTube right now. We can start whenever you want. Dr. Arijit, the stage is all yours.
Thank you, thank you. First of all, welcome to our conference, our webinar. First of all, I want to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Hall. Professor Hall is from University of Canterbury, New Zealand. And first, on behalf of the organization committee, I would like to express our deepest gratitude for accepting our invitation to the conference Managing Tourism Across Continents. I also thank the organization committee for giving me such an opportunity for moderating this meeting. Professor Holtz is co-editor-in-chief of Current Issues in Tourism, as you know, which is among the top-tier journals in the tourism field. And he also has numerous publications as we follow articles and books. His research interests include tourism and human mobility, regional development and social green marketing, with particular emphasis on issues of place branding and marketing, as well as conservation and environmental change, event management and marketing, and the use of tourism as an economic development and conservation mechanism. Professor Hall's recent research interests include also wine, food, marketing, and gastronomy. Because our time is limited, I end my words here and give the floor to Professor Hall for his presentation. After the presentation, we will have 10 minutes question answer session. So, all right, Professor Hall, please, you may start your presentation now. After your presentation,
thank you very much.
So we will have question answer session. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome everyone. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending where you are around the world. It's a rather interesting topic, a very general one, tourism for a better world. And I must admit, it's something that perhaps we are all looking for. I don't know about many of you, but frankly, currently I'm exhausted. With COVID for so long, we have been teaching in different modes, both live and online at the same time. Students have COVID, staff have COVID. I'm sure it's the same all over. We are exhausted. I think, therefore, my reflections on the topic are going to be somewhat personal and possibly somewhat provocative, because I've been trying to think what a better world may look like when we have some of the current issues we're facing. In looking at some of these things, for example, I wonder very much what the notion of better is. Better is a normative concept, i.e., you have a standard you use to say it's better, and we have different betters. This is a family photograph. This is my family. This is my mother, father, and my grandparents. I was raised very much by my grandmother. I'm not sure what my grandmother would say about the world these days. She grew up as a maid. My family's background is quite poor. My father worked on the railways. And it's interesting to think what they would regard as better. All of my family is now gone. My last brother died at the start of COVID. I haven't even been able to travel to go see where he's buried. And I'm not the only person like that. And I think it leaves lots of us thinking about, well, what does travel mean? What benefits are there, both personally and collectively? What do we want from travel and tourism? What do we want in terms not just of my forebears, but of my child? What future do I want for him, given that many of those things that I love have now disappeared or have gone? Probably some of the greatest love of my life has disappeared, potentially, because of what's been happening. So if we're thinking of better, whose better is it? What is better? How is it going to be better? Who? Where? When will it be better? And at what scale is it going to be better? And I think these are the questions I want to be addressing in terms of this notion of better and what it means at a time like this. If we're thinking of better, well, who's going to be better? Whose version of better should we be seeking to implement or even reach? With some notions of a better world, who is included and who is excluded? And how does tourism fit in that? There are many tourisms in which not everyone is welcome because of your color, of your religion, of your sexuality, of a whole range of different things. How do we include those people? There are many who say they shouldn't be included, but why? There are many different versions of what might constitute an ideal society, an ideal industry, or even an ideal person. How do we deal with that? I think ideals are very important, but I always struggle when some people's ideals are to the exclusion of others. I can have my ideal, but you can't have yours. I struggle with that, but there are many countries around the world which are doing that or even seeking to impose that on other countries. How, therefore, do we become inclusive, which is one of those terms we use a lot in tourism, but I'm often not quite convinced it's actually thought through as much as it should be. How tolerant and expansive is our notion of inclusion in tourism and elsewhere? Because surely, if we're having some kind of notion of better, it should somehow be better for everyone. What should be better? A classic tourism system model. But where does tourism fit into that? Do we see tourism as being in isolation from some of the bigger issues and problems we face? What do we see as getting better? The economy, society, environment, culture? Do we just think at a destination level? Is it the industry? Are we just concerned with the tourist experience? Do we put that at the forefront? Or is it all of those things somehow? How do we get better? Is it by diktat of Big Brother or some other authoritarian leader? What form of governance and how we implement things do we use? What combination should be used? Because each of these approaches to trying to achieve something have their advantages and disadvantages and their supporters and deniers. Most importantly, to me at least, will they be inclusive? Which therefore means, will they be genuinely democratic? Democracy isn't everything. Democracy doesn't bring everything everyone wants. But to me, it's an important ideal. Who are we looking to have a better world? Whose better world are we aiming to improve? Is it the tourist? Is that our only focus? Is it the owners? Should it be shareholders? Or should we have a wider notion? Should it be employees? Which I always find an interesting one, because I often think that in the tourism industry and tourism education, we give nowhere near enough attention to the welfare of employees. And I'm thinking about that at a global scale. Is it the destination community? Or should we be concerned about specific groups in society? Should we be much more concerned about gender equality, making sure that everyone is given equal opportunity? Surely that's important. But there may be some who disagree with that. There may be some societies in which women are treated as second-class citizens. There may be some conferences where that's occurred. I don't know. But surely that's an issue that we need to be considering as a global community of scholars. And it may not be gender. Is it, again, is it ethnicity? Is it religion? Is it the color of your skin that is a problem in terms of who you are and who we are trying to improve the lot of? Is it the lower socioeconomic groups in society. I come from a poor family background, so for me, that's an important item. Where should tourism be developed to make things better? Under what conditions should tourism development occur? And what's the purpose of tourism development? I was born in the UK in a town called Margate, one of the first ever tourist resorts. By the time I arrived in the world, it was already fairly run down. It's now been rejuvenated also by tourism. But it's interesting, having come through a lived tourism experience, both as somewhere where I lived, also in terms of where I worked before academia, because I never meant to be an academic. One of those things that happened. But it's really then interesting looking at these kinds of issues, because one of the things I realized in terms of my hometown, or where I was born at least, is that tourism was not always a good thing. Too much dependence on tourism led to a decline at one stage. And surely, therefore, that becomes an important issue of thinking about the where in terms of betterment. What is its role in spatial betterment? Even if you put in tourist infrastructure, do the people who you want to benefit actually benefit? Or do they end up being forced out because of other issues like housing? In theory, that shouldn't happen, because we are aware very much in an Airbnb world of those kind of linkages. But how often does that take place in a tourism development context? How often do we think outside of the tourism box? Who are the winners and losers, and why? And when should betterment occur? The slide here shows bleached coral reef, the Great Barrier Reef, as a result of too much heat and climate change. This year is the first year that it's had coral bleaching in what would normally be a cooler year. It says something about the role of time and improvement, or not, as the case may be. What metric do you use for the when? How far ahead do you think? And very importantly, how do we come to understand the cumulative effects of tourism? Those little effects, one on top of the other. By themselves, they're not significant perhaps, but you add them together and you have problems. So to me, it's about also at what scale. Better for who, better for what, when, where, how, but at what scale? Are we talking the individual? Are we talking organizations, communities, destinations, and above? Because each of these scales have their own issues, they have their own connectivities. And just because you have success at one scale, or you have betterment at one scale, it doesn't mean things automatically become better at the other. We know from our research on resilience that what we see as transformation, what we see as transition, and what we see as normal actually is tied into our positionality. Where are we in the tourism system? What scale are we talking about? Because we usually never make this clear. We're often far too nebulous in how we talk about tourism. And this is a really important point, because change works up as well as down. You may have something that is successful at one level, but it may have unintended consequences at other levels. If we're having this brave new vision of a better world, how do we allow for that? Do we even care? Because I think that's an important question. And again, in thinking about the topic, I was also thinking, is the problem really one of tourism research for a better world? Are tourism researchers the problem? Am I the problem in trying to have a better world? And when thinking about this, I'm almost saying perhaps. And I have a few things I'd like to comment on. I think we cannot separate ourselves from where we research, live, work, love, travel, often though we often pretend to. If betterment is a normative concept, what then are our normative values? How do we express them? Because it often seems to me that we often have notions of engagement in tourism very narrowly defined. And I think there's also a very artificial barrier placed between social science and research and decision-making over there. We give advice. That's what we do. We give advice, independent advice. I'm not so sure. Are we really objective, even though we pretend to be? Should we even try to be? Or perhaps we pretend to be objective because we think we might have more impact. Where are our values? What are our values for a better world in terms of our research? And it then raises the question, what then is the purpose of tourism education and universities that teach it? Are our jobs to be trainers, or are we actually interested in thinking and education? Because training and education are different. I'm all in favor of training. I worked in kitchens long enough, but at the same time, I want people to think. And that means asking difficult questions and thinking about values. We cannot escape this normative problem of our values. So how then do we look to become more transparent? How can we be more inclusive? How can we be more inclusive in terms of research and education for women, minorities, and whatever other we want to consider, unless we consider these things? What are of our subject matter? What are the assumptions, the hidden values that lie within it? And how do they affect how our notions of better are shaped? Are we too accepting of stakeholders? Are we too accepting sometimes of what governments say you should do? And I think these are important questions, because after COVID-19, what form of transformation in different tourisms will we have? There's actually a long history of the search for new tourisms. We've gone all the way from alternative tourism in the 70s through to ethical tourism in the 90s, ecotourism, degrowing tourism, inclusive tourism. Now we have tourism in the SDGs. Now we also have transformative and regenerative tourism. All of these are about better tourisms. At the same time, we have been searching for those better tourisms, the impact of tourism, the negative impact of tourism, even just in terms of the environment, has grown. That is something which is an absolute fact. We cannot ignore that. So what has our search for these alternative tourisms actually brought? And what's next? We have a whole new range of other problems coming, not just in terms of COVID, but we have climate change, we have biodiversity loss, we have ecocide. And if we're really unlucky, we were going to have a new Cold War. How then do we respond to that? How do our values respond to that? Do we even articulate our values in what we do? Because we have a problem. We only have one planet. The current approach is just to move the tourists around, which is fine. But if you keep moving the tourists around, you still only have one planet, people. That means the amounts of capital you have gets run down because it's being used by the tourism economy. And it therefore means you may have a small sustainable island within that, but it can be surrounded by this huge unsustainable mess, and we still do not get anywhere. This is the problem that we face. Why do we face it? I would argue because we don't articulate our values and contest them enough. If we think about sustainability, so much of the focus is on efficiency. It's on efficiency. It is on technological solutions. It's not dealing with the heart of the problem, which is how we live. What values do we espouse when we travel? Only what values do we espouse? How does our behavior match with them? It's not just efficiency, it's also sufficiency. It's what we consume, it's our behavior. And how then do we respond to that? And importantly, and that's why this big green screen came up, it's all surrounded by the environment because we only have one planet. We only have one planet. It's an obvious thing to say, but the repercussions of it are enormous because somehow we have to learn to live together and sort this out. And to me, if I'm thinking any idea of a better world, that would be part of it. My grandfather fought against, I would guess, some of your grandfathers actually in the First World War. We can live together. And I'm sure maybe some of you, your grandfathers, like my grandfather, never wanted to talk about the experience because they were haunted by it so much. That's part of a better world, though. Talking, confronting the past, looking at heritage, and tourism is obviously important with that. But how do we bring these things together, particularly when there's often a focus on efficiency? And I want to focus on, just very briefly, an issue which I know is going to be coming up at the conference, because one of the issues I'm trying to raise here, I think there's far too much focus in thinking about efficiency, far too much focus in terms of the technology without looking at the bigger picture. In Maori, here in New Zealand, there's a very important saying. What is important? It is people, it is people, it is people. The technology, the efficiency is for people and their well-being, not the other way around. Yet if I read much of the documentation and writing and research in tourism, the focus is on the supposed inherent values of technology and ICT. Digitalization may actually be very useful. It can be very helpful in terms of energy transition, more efficient. It can be very useful for minimizing energy use in restaurants, very useful for energy grids. Ideally, they should be ecologically resilient. AI computing can be great too. There's clearly many positive environmental, social, and other impacts. But, and this is the but, how smart is all of this? I would argue that so much of the writing about smart tourism as just one example of there being so much focus on efficiency and of often notions of growth in tourism doesn't always see the big picture. You can't see the forest for the trees. What is the bigger impact? What is the bigger consideration? Some things may be good for some tourism businesses, but that may mean wider issues are ignored. There's lots of focus these days on virtual tourism. I find that fascinating. But is it actually a risk that will actually encourage people to travel more, be a substitute? Do we care? What about new opportunities? I often think there's so much focus on the digital that authenticity is definitely going to make a comeback. If digitalization and efficiency is everywhere, how then is difference going to be achieved in a business context? How many more apps can people have? Innovation adoption is nothing new, but like always, it carries risk, and there are always winners and losers. Not everyone's life is going to be better. Is my life that much more improved because I can use a smartphone to turn my fridge on rather than using a switch by hand? Probably not, actually. To me, it's about getting back to the basics. Getting back to the basics. And that also means in academic terms, really assessing things properly, thinking of the direct order effects, thinking of the enabling effects, and thinking of the structural effects. And given the topic of the conference and the reason that time is important, we should be taking a life cycle perspective, not doing what we normally do in most tourism studies, which is one-shot studies, here, here, and here, but not necessarily connecting them all together so we have a good longitudinal understanding of what's happening, because then we can understand what the rebound effects may be, what the structural effects may be, and what the social impacts may be. I think there is enormous potential for ICT in terms of sustainable tourism. But what else does there need to be? It means that the equipment for the start, we have to acknowledge it has impacts. What are the design criteria? How long will it last for? How repairable is it? Do we have open standards, or will we continue to have the situation where the technology is in the hands of a small few bunch of billionaires? Do we have a right to repair? Because that's important for reducing waste. These are issues which are hardly considered in the tourism literature, yet there's so much focus on e-tourism, smart tourism, without seeing the big picture. And it raises question then about, well, how can tourism contribute to a better world? Unless you see the big picture, you're just looking in isolation with blinkers around you. How can you have a better world if that's the case? So my challenge to myself as well as my community is that we need to be considering these issues, the full implications of innovations, the full implications of technology, and the full implications of business strategies and business models, to ensure they include people considerations as a part of it. Efficiency in technology isn't everything, because you have to be aware of the conditions as well. We have an uncertain future, probably in the last few months more so than ever. What should change? Ideally, everything. But what should it change to? What do we need to do to make the values required and the discussions required more transparent? To me, if tourism studies is going to contribute to a better world, it needs to be much more transparent and honest than what it is at present. We need to lay bare the inherent biases that exist in industry, tourism studies, and in what I and we do. It needs to be clearer. Those biases in terms of gender, those biases in terms of religion, those biases in terms of ethnicity. That kind of argument doesn't fit into what's normally taught, which is normally based on some kind of, I used to call it economics 101 rationalism. Most of what we have is narrowly focused, is technocratic, it doesn't question enough. Education is about thinking and questioning, not just training. Training is good. Education is even better. It means we have to get beyond just focusing on efficiency and growth, particularly tourism growth being intrinsically good. That's been an argument for 40, 50 years, but most of the material and papers that are published don't reflect that. They are still, even without even realizing it, focusing on growth. Change is about moving from one state to another. It's about considering what's really important. And really importantly, it's about the human and ethical perspectives that we have. A better world isn't just so much about tourism, it's about our ethical perspectives. It's about our inclusiveness. It's about our willingness to talk to each other. I think tourism can be a part of that, but it's a conversation that is not happening anywhere near enough. I think we need to move beyond some kind of normative notion that better is just about the tourist experience. No, it's not. The tourist experience, to me at least, is a means to an end, because it's about to the issue of what is tourism actually for? What is tourism actually for? And why do we want it? Apart from the fact we are all tourists ourselves, to me, the focus of tourism and my work is ultimately about the destination community. And because of that, I'll conclude with this statement. What is best for tourism? What is better for the world? In some cases, maybe fewer tourists, or in many cases, no tourism at all. In many cases, the most sustainable form of tourism is no tourism. Because what we need to do in order to be better and to be sustainable is to think beyond tourism. You think of tourism, but you also think of beyond that at the same time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Hall, for your valuable contribution to our conference by sharing your presentation, including important and vital questions addressing the potential in political and social effects on tourism and the the outcomes or the effects of tourism on community and the environment. On my side, one of the most important questions you addressed here, how to how do we achieve a digital sustainability, or how do we achieve the technology-driven digitalization based on the sustainable principles? Thank you very much. Any questions? Dear host, I couldn't see the participants who were to ask, so could we help? So, any questions? Dear host?
Yes, Dr. Arjit, hear me?
Yes, now I hear. So, any questions?
There is
For
no
the
question in that box. No question in that box. If you have, yes,
on chat box. Okay.
yes,
Let me check. Let me check.
yes, we still have time.
Okay. Now I check, but I couldn't see any question here.
People need more coffee in the morning, clearly.
So, dear guests and participants, do you have any questions for the presentation of Professor Hall regarding the digitalization, sustainability, and the impacts of the digital transformation on the social community and the environment? There are important questions that we have to the young researchers. So I think so. No question. Interesting.
I clearly put people to sleep.
So yes, you very well clarify all the questions and you direct us. Okay, Professor Hall, I'm really grateful for your contribution. So you addressed many important questions for us, and I think young researchers in tourism have focused on these questions regarding how do we achieve technology-driven transformation in our industry. So with the advance of the technology, cutting-edge technologies, so many scholars and researchers have focused on developing a new frameworks and models regarding the technology-driven transformation. But we have to also consider the sustainability principles as you addressed in your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So now, if you don't have questions, I close this webinar. Dear participants. Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Professor Hall. Bye. Thank you for
Bye.
your contribution.
Okay. Thank you so much for your presentation. And thank you so much, Dr. Arjit, for your moderation. Our next session will start in 20 minutes. So we have a break like 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you for your participation.